In the year 2025, the politics of Nigeria reached a point that nobody could ignore. The tension between the government and the people had already been building for years. The voices of frustration were growing, and the demand for change was stronger than ever. In the middle of this storm was President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, a man who believed he could hold the country together with the power of control and silence. But it was in this very year that Tinubu made what many would later call the biggest mistake of his political life, a mistake that changed the future of Nigeria and made Nnamdi Kanu an unstoppable force. Tinubu had one clear belief: if Nnamdi Kanu remained locked up, his influence would fade. He thought that time behind bars would weaken Kanu's spirit, break his movement, and silence the millions of voices that supported him. To Tinubu, it was a simple strategy: keep him in detention, cut him off from his people, and sooner or later the cries for his release would die out. It was the same method used by leaders before him. But what Tinubu failed to understand was that Nigeria had changed, and so had the world. In the digital age, voices could not be caged. Ideas could not be imprisoned. When you locked a man behind bars, his image often became stronger than his actual presence. And this is exactly what happened with Nnamdi Kanu. Tinubu's biggest mistake was thinking that imprisonment meant silence. But the silence became louder than words. Every day that Kanu remained in detention, more people began to ask questions. Why was he still there? Why was the government afraid of letting him speak? Why did the cries of justice fall on deaf ears? These questions traveled from one corner of Nigeria to another. Markets, schools, churches, mosques, villages, and cities carried the whispers. Soon those whispers became conversations, and those conversations became debates. Even those who had once disagreed with Kanu began to admit that something was not right. The mistake grew larger because Tinubu ignored the emotions of ordinary people. He looked at politics as a game of power, but he forgot that power belongs to the people. Nigerians were already dealing with hardship, economic struggles, rising prices, insecurity, and a feeling of being abandoned by their leaders. In such a time, the image of one man standing firm against the system became more powerful than any speech. Tinubu thought detaining Kanu would weaken him, but in reality, it turned him into a symbol. Symbols are dangerous for those in power, because symbols do not need food, water, or freedom to survive. Symbols live in the hearts and minds of people. Nnamdi Kanu became that symbol. He became the face of resistance, the picture of courage, the proof that someone could endure suffering for a cause bigger than himself. Another mistake Tinubu made was failing to listen. Leadership requires listening, not just commanding. When millions of voices rose to demand Kanu's release, Tinubu dismissed them as noise. He saw them as a minority, as troublemakers, as distractions from his rule. But the truth was that these voices carried the anger of a generation. Young people especially felt betrayed. They saw no jobs, no future, no hope, and no plan from the government. And in Kanu's struggle, they saw their own. By refusing to release him, Tinubu created a rallying point that no election campaign could buy. Kanu became the center of conversations in homes, on the streets, and even in the diaspora. Nigerians outside the country joined the chorus, writing letters, staging protests, and using social media to remind the world of his condition. The government tried to control the story, but every attempt only made the story bigger. History has always shown that when leaders try to silence a man with influence, they often create a legend. That was exactly what happened in 2025. Tinubu's mistake was not simply that he kept Kanu in detention, it was that he underestimated the power of time. Time can destroy, but it can also build. In this case, time built Kanu's image into something beyond politics, beyond detention, beyond fear. As days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, the strength of Kanu's movement grew like wildfire. Even people who had once stood far away from his cause began to sympathize with him. Some said, "I may not agree with his ideas, but no man deserves this treatment." Others said, "If the government is afraid of his voice, then maybe his voice carries truth." These were dangerous words for Tinubu, because they showed that his control was slipping. It is one thing to face a political opponent who speaks openly. It is another thing entirely to face an idea that grows stronger in silence. You can argue against a man, but how do you argue against a movement born from his suffering? Tinubu did not see this coming. He believed that power was about control, but real power was shifting to the people, and the people had chosen to see Kanu as their own. This was Tinubu's biggest mistake in 2025. He thought he could bury Nnamdi Kanu in silence, but instead he planted him like a seed. And that seed began to grow into a tree that could not be cut down. By the time the realization began to dawn, it was already too late. The silence had turned into a storm, and the storm was not just about Kanu anymore. It was about the people's anger, the people's hope, and the people's demand for justice. In trying to weaken one man, Tinubu had given birth to a force that no chains could hold. From the walls of his prison cell, Nnamdi Kanu became more powerful than many politicians who walked freely on the streets. It was a strange reality, but one that revealed a deep truth about leadership and influence. Real power is not always about position, wealth, or control of the government. Real power is about conviction, courage, and the ability to inspire people, even in silence. This truth played out in 2025, as Kanu's detention turned into a source of energy for millions of people who looked at him not just as a man, but as a living idea. When Tinubu kept him locked up, he believed that Kanu's voice would fade away. But instead of fading, the message of Kanu began to spread faster than ever. People who had never attended his rallies or followed his words closely started paying attention. They saw him not just as a political figure, but as a man willing to suffer for what he believed in. That image carried more weight than any press conference or campaign promise coming from the government. The power of Kanu was not in what he said daily, because in detention he had no chance to speak. The power was in what people believed he stood for. Every hardship Nigerians faced, rising food prices, insecurity, joblessness, and hopelessness, was tied in their minds to his story. They felt that if he could endure prison for a cause, then they too could endure and resist the suffering forced upon them. His silence became their voice, and his suffering became their strength. The government tried different ways to reduce his influence. Sometimes they ignored the calls for his release. Other times, they pushed propaganda to paint him as a threat. But the people were not blind. They could see clearly that his detention was not solving the country's problems. Instead, it was fueling anger and unity. In villages, cities, and communities, people began to whisper that if the government was this afraid of one man's freedom, then maybe that man carried a truth the government did not want the people to hear. Soon, Kanu was no longer just a leader of a particular group. He became a national symbol of resistance. He stood as a reminder that leadership is not about luxury or titles but about sacrifice. The more the government tried to silence him, the more people respected him. His strength was no longer in speeches, it was in endurance. People admired the fact that even when locked up, he did not break. And in that unbroken spirit, they found inspiration. The power of Kanu was also seen in how he united unlikely groups of people. At first, only his strongest supporters shouted for his release. But as time passed, others joined in. Religious leaders, market women, students, activists, and even those who once disagreed with his methods started speaking up. They said, "We may not support everything he stands for, but no man deserves to be treated this way. Justice must be done." That was the point at which his struggle went beyond himself. It became bigger than one man. It became a movement that cut across tribes, faiths, and backgrounds. This growth of support showed the weakness of Tinubu's strategy. The president believed that detaining Kanu would scatter his followers, but instead, it gathered more followers than ever before. The name Nnamdi Kanu turned into a symbol of courage for anyone who felt ignored by the system. It gave people a rallying point, something to hold on to in a time of despair. Even those in the diaspora, Nigerians abroad who longed for justice and fairness, took his case as their own. They carried his name into international discussions, ensuring that the world would not forget. Another form of his power came from the fact that he became untouchable in people's minds. A politician can lose support when he fails in office, but Kanu was not in office. He was not making promises he could not keep. He was simply enduring suffering for his people. That alone placed him in a position where criticism could not easily reach him. To the people, he was not a leader who failed. He was a leader who was being punished for standing firm. That distinction made his influence much stronger than any politician who held power in 2025. This reality scared the government, because no matter what they did, they could not erase him. Even in silence, he spoke louder than them. They held press briefings, gave speeches, and promised reforms, but the people's minds always returned to Kanu. Every time they faced hardship, they remembered his face. Every time they felt ignored, they remembered his struggle. He was not present in their towns and cities, but his spirit was everywhere. The power of Kanu in 2025 showed clearly that leadership by sacrifice is stronger than leadership by force. Tinubu had the army, the police, the government offices, and the media at his command. Yet, despite all that, he could not match the simple image of one man sitting in detention, refusing to give up on his people. That was the true balance of power. By the middle of the year, it was clear that Kanu's influence had escaped beyond the control of Tinubu's government. His name had become too heavy to silence. People used it to challenge authority. They used it to demand justice. They used it to inspire hope. And the more the government tried to stop it, the stronger it grew. Kanu became more than a prisoner. He became a mirror of Nigeria's pain and a light for its hope. His power was not in what he held in his hands, but in what people carried in their hearts when they spoke his name. That was why he could not be stopped. When Peter Obi first heard about the way Tinubu had handled Nnamdi Kanu in 2025, he was not surprised. For months, he had watched the government struggle to manage the growing discontent in the country. He had seen the rising anger among the youth, the endless complaints from ordinary Nigerians, and the government's refusal to listen. But when it became clear that Tinubu's biggest mistake had been turning Kanu into an unstoppable figure, Obi knew the truth had finally caught up with the president. Peter Obi was not the kind of leader who raised his voice or used harsh words. His strength was in speaking with calmness, but with truth. He always believed that leadership was not about force, but about solving problems. So, when he reacted, his words were direct, simple, and sharp. He said, "Power is not measured by how long you can hold somebody down. Real power is measured by how well you can solve the problems of the people. If you keep a man locked up, but the problems of the people remain, then you are not strong. You are only afraid." These words spread quickly across the country. They captured exactly what many Nigerians already felt in their hearts. Tinubu's government had focused on suppressing Kanu instead of addressing the root issues: justice, fairness, equality, and economic opportunity. And in doing so, they made him more powerful than ever. Obi understood this perfectly, because his politics had always been centered on listening to people, not silencing them. For Obi, the issue was not just about Kanu's detention. It was about what that detention represented. To him, Kanu's situation was a mirror showing Nigeria's deeper sickness, the government's habit of ignoring the cries of its citizens. He believed that if the government had chosen dialogue, if they had chosen to address the pain of the people honestly, the story of 2025 would have been different. But Tinubu had chosen pride and force. And in that choice, he made Kanu a symbol of freedom. Obi was clear in pointing out that Nigeria had missed an opportunity. He said, instead of silencing him, we should have asked ourselves, why are millions listening to him? Why do people feel his struggle represents them? Those are the questions a serious leader must answer. His reaction was not just political, it was moral. Obi believed in justice, and he believed that injustice only produces more resistance. He often repeated that when leaders refuse to solve problems, the problems eventually grow bigger than them. And that was exactly what had happened with Kanu. When the news spread that Obi had spoken on Tinubu's mistake, many Nigerians nodded in agreement. They felt that he had voiced the truth without fear, something that most politicians were too scared to do. Some even said Obi's reaction gave them hope, because it showed that there were still leaders in Nigeria who could speak with honesty and conscience. Obi also reminded Nigerians that leaders are judged by how they respond to crises. In his words, a crisis is not solved by putting people in chains. A crisis is solved by building trust, by showing fairness, and by proving that government belongs to the people. Once you fail to do this, the crisis grows. That is what has happened here. These words carried weight because Obi was known as a leader who valued humility and accountability. People trusted that when he spoke, he was not trying to gain cheap popularity. He was speaking what he truly believed. That sincerity made his reaction even more powerful. At the same time, Obi did not hide his concern for Nigeria's future. He worried that by making Kanu unstoppable, Tinubu had also created a new wave of resistance that the government was not prepared to handle. He warned that if leaders continued to ignore justice, they would only push the country deeper into division and chaos. But he also saw hope. He saw that Kanu's growing influence was proof that Nigerians still cared deeply about justice, and that they had not given up on demanding change. In private conversations, Obi was said to have reflected on the irony of the situation. He noted that Tinubu had all the instruments of power, security forces, political structures, and influence. Yet all that power could not defeat the simple strength of one man's sacrifice. To him, it was a lesson that no leader should ever forget. People may fear force for a while, but they will always follow truth in the end. For Obi, the rise of Kanu in 2025 was both a warning and a call. It was a warning to those in power that injustice will always backfire. And it was a call to all Nigerians to stand firm in demanding fairness, no matter the cost. He believed that the energy surrounding Kanu could be turned into something greater if it was channeled into building a better Nigeria. But he also knew that it required wisdom, humility, and dialogue, qualities that the government had so far refused to show. His reaction left a deep mark on the national conversation. Many Nigerians began to say that Obi's words were not just about Kanu, but about the kind of country they wanted to live in. They wanted a Nigeria where no one needed to be silenced to keep the peace, where justice was not delayed, and where leaders understood that the people's trust was the greatest power of all. By the end of 2025, it was clear that Obi's calm but strong response had captured the heart of the matter. Tinubu's mistake had made Kanu unstoppable, but it had also opened the eyes of millions to what true leadership should look like. And in that moment, Peter Obi stood as the voice of reason, reminding Nigeria that justice, not force, is the foundation of real